Good morning. Globally, the big picture is a mix of intensifying geopolitical risk, climate-driven disruption, and a fast-moving technology and energy transition that is starting to show up in policy and markets. On global conflict, attention remains fixed on the Middle East and the consequences of the U.S.-Israeli confrontation with Iran. SBS reports debate is growing over whether calls for regime change have backfired, with some arguing Iran's leadership has been strengthened rather than weakened. The BBC reports the UN nuclear watchdog says inspectors are expected to visit Iranian sites as part of a war-related deal framework, though Iranian officials are signaling access would only come with a final agreement with the US. In Europe, the BBC reports Ukraine strikes have left parts of Sevastopol and Crimea without power, underlining ongoing infrastructure vulnerability in the war. On the global economy, the Financial Times flags a major sovereign risk development. Venezuela is set to reveal a much larger than expected debt pile, around $240 billion, as it moves toward what's described as the world's largest restructuring following the overthrow of Maduro. The FT also argues Russia's system is in slow implosion, pointing to weakening fiscal discipline as a key stress point. In the US, the SMH reports President Trump is holding up a housing bill while pushing Republicans to pass the SAVE Act on voter ID, keeping political uncertainty elevated. On the technological revolution and artificial intelligence, the SMH reports business electrification and energy-hungry AI are expected to be major drivers of power demand, with Australia's grid demand tipped to double over 25 years as data centers expand. This is a material signal for infrastructure planning, energy policy, and investment settings, because AI growth is increasingly constrained not just by chips and talent, but by electricity and grid connections. Separately, Al Jazeera highlights how geopolitics is intersecting with consumer tech supply chains, pointing to an Israeli-developed chip reportedly used in Apple's iPhone 17e. Climate impacts are also becoming an economic and political story in their own right. The SMH and BBC report extreme heat across Europe, with the UK recording its hottest June day and France breaking records, alongside power outages and renewed debate over air conditioning and resilience. Turning to Australia, inflation and cost of living remain central. SBS reports Treasurer Jim Chalmers says fuel at size is not the whole story as underlying inflation rises, and he warns the costs and consequences of the Middle East war will be felt for some time. The conversation similarly argues underlying inflation is still too high, keeping the possibility of another interest rate hike on the table even as petrol prices ease. On the housing and broader economy, ABC reports Domain is forecasting price falls over the year ahead of up to 7% in Sydney and 8% in Melbourne as the market cools, though resale profits are reportedly at a record, suggesting uneven impacts between recent buyers and long-term owners. The Guardian reports the proposed capital gains tax discount changes are already affecting behavior even before becoming law, with the debate now sharpening around housing affordability, wealth inequality, and vested interests. On Australian government policy and politics, the SMH reports Teal independents Sally Stegall and Allegra Spender are forming a new party, Community Strom Australia, aiming for Senate representation, but without naming a leader. For the Australian Public Service and National Security settings, the conversation reports ASIO Director General Mike Burgess says a former Australian resident directed the attack on a Melbourne synagogue, a significant development for threat assessments and counter-extremism posture. Finally, locally, there are two notable public interest developments to watch. The conversation reports bird flu has now spread to 2 Australian states, raising concerns for biodiversity and biosecurity, and SBS reports researchers say they have evidence of what could be Earth's oldest known asteroid impact site, dating back 3 billion years, a major scientific claim that will draw scrutiny and follow-up. That's the latest on the material developments to start the day.